Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jackie Boards. I'm from CounterTools, and with me I have Amanda Kong, who will be your presenter for today, and I'm going to be your moderator. The title of today's webinar is The Intersection of Tobacco and the Military, and we're going to have Amanda Kong talk about a recent study that she published along with a couple of other co-authors titled The Availability, Price, and Promotions for Cigarettes and Non-Cigarette Tobacco Products, an observational comparison of U.S. Air Force bases with nearby tobacco retailers. So let's get started. I want to do a quick check before we get fully started. If you can hear me and if you can see my slides, please put that in the chat box. Please put yes or no, I can't hear you, see you, or see your slides or hear you in the chat box real quick. Okay, it looks like everyone can see the slides on the screen and hear me. Let's continue. Okay, so before we get started, let's do a little webinar housekeeping. I know some of you all have used Zoom before, some of you all haven't, but if you haven't used Zoom, so you're muted by default. In order to be unmuted, we have to unmute you from our end. So if you want to be unmuted, just let us know by raising your hand, but you will probably not need to be unmuted during this webinar today. The chat function is another function you will be using. Please send any general messages or comments in the chat function. No specific questions should go on the chat function, just any general things, like say if your technology isn't working or you're having some issues, just drop that in the chat box. And if you have any just kind of random comments, you can also put that in the chat box too. Like I mentioned, you can raise your hand if you want to get our attention or if you want to be unmuted. And then lastly, and most importantly, is the QA function. This is where we're going to be fielding all of the questions through. So please drop all of your specific questions about the content or any other questions you have in the Q&A box. So chat box for more general things if you're having any issues, and then the Q&A box for any specific questions throughout the webinar you have. And here is just a visual of what the chat function and the Q&A functions look like. So the chat function you can send to everyone or just send to us. And then the Q&A function you can send to everyone or just send anonymously. So again, please use the chat for any random things or any comments or any specific issues you have, in the Q&A for any questions you might have. That's about it. Let me do one more check. Is anyone having any problems with seeing these slides or hearing me? Just maybe a couple more yeses in there so I can know that everything's working well. Okay, great. Looks like everything's working good. So now I'm going to hand it off to Amanda, and she will be, like I said, your presenter for today.
Great, thanks, Jackie. So before I start and talk about this study, I do want to just make a few disclosures. So the funding for the study that I'll be talking about today was provided by the National Institute on Drug Abuse and also through UNC's Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center. And then just a disclaimer here that the views expressed in the study are those of the authors and do not reflect any of the official views of the Department of Defense or of the funders. So for today's agenda, I'm just going to go over a quick overview. So we'll do a background and some information on past studies. I'll talk about the current study aims, the methods and measures. I'll also go over the results of the study, and then some discussion and implications. And then finally, I'll field some questions about the study that you may all have. So I do want to let you guys know that this study was just recently published in Tobacco Control, and so it is available for download. I also want to bring attention to one of the co-authors listed here, Dr. Melissa Little. So Dr. Little has expertise in studying tobacco use among military populations. And while today I will just be talking about the methods and results of this study, Dr. Little will be on an upcoming CounterTools podcast. So as you're going through this webinar with me, and at the end, if you all have specific questions about tobacco use in the military, be sure to write those down. And at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about how you can submit those questions to Dr. Little for the podcast. So just as a warm-up exercise, if you all could enter your answers into the chat box, what do you already know about the military population and smoking or tobacco use? And what are some things that come to mind when you think about the tobacco point of sale environment in the military? So if you all just want to take a couple minutes and put some of those thoughts in, and we will review over those in the box.
We've gotten one comment in that said higher smoking prevalence in the military. Another comment that said higher rates of military tobacco use versus the general population. Another comment that said cheaper prices on military bases. We have another comment that says about 4 in 10 initiate tobacco use in the military. Another comment that said no taxes on base for tobacco products. Someone else said prices for cigarettes near military bases are typically lower than those not located near bases. And a great comment by Nina Baltiera here at Counter Tools. She said the history of the government providing troops with tobacco.
Right. So you all know a lot, and several of those things are things that I'll touch on today and that we looked at in our study. So thank you for that participation. So as many of you have already noted, you know a lot about this subject matter. And so to begin, I'm just going to go over some background. So the Department of Defense, or the US DoD, spends more than $1.6 billion each year on health costs and lost productivity due to tobacco-related health issues. And military personnel who use tobacco have been shown to have worse physical and mental health, and they're also at a greater risk of early discharge compared with their non-smoking colleagues who are in the service. And so here's just a graphic that's showing us the 30-day prevalence of tobacco use. So in the darker blue here, we have the active duty military, and the lighter blue, we have civilian. So right here on the left, we have cigarette smoking, and we can see that cigarette smoking is a lot higher at 24% compared to the civilian population at 18%. And these numbers that were taken were back in 2011, so they're a little bit outdated if you are looking at the civilian prevalence right now and thinking that should be a little bit lower. And so then with smokeless, we also see this disparity of where active duty military are using smokeless tobacco at much higher rates than the civilian population. And so we can further break down cigarette smoking behaviors by service branch, and we do see some differences. So just to orient you all, if you look at the top here, this is where the different branches are, and then we have the percent of people in those branches using and being these types of smokers. So I'll just point out a few key things here. If you look to the left part of the graph, here we have abstainers or never smokers, or have smoked less than 100 cigarettes in their lifetime. And we see that both the Army and Marine Corps have the lowest prevalence of never smokers at around 53 to 55%. Looking at former smokers, which is the next graphic, we see that the Coast Guard has the highest percent at about 21%. And then here at the far left are heavy smokers. And so those are people who are smoking a pack or more a day, or 20 cigarettes or more a day. And we see those rates are highest and range from 1.6% in the Air Force to 4.1% in the Marine Corps. So there are some differences between branches in tobacco use prevalence. So there are several tobacco use risk factors for the military population, and I'll just go over a few of those. So some include demographics. So the military is made up of predominantly male and young and non-Hispanic white persons. High school education or less has also been shown to be a risk factor. Psychosocial risk factors such as risk-taking behaviors, and also high use of alcohol. And then finally, also the stress of military deployment and being in the service. So one of the big environmental risk factors that many of you mentioned in your comments are that low prices are associated with increased tobacco consumption and relapse. And so this has been shown in many populations, not just in the military. And so the Department of Defense issued an instruction or a policy in the early to mid 2000s about the pricing of tobacco products. And so this instruction read that the prices of tobacco products sold in military resale outlets in the US, its territories and possessions, shall be no higher than the most competitive commercial price in the local community. And then the key here, no lower than 5% below the most competitive commercial price in the local community. And as one participant noted, what about taxes? So one of the things missing from this, or that isn't specified, is whether that competitive price in that 5% includes taxes, and taxes are not charged on bases and on exchanges. So after this policy was implemented, several pricing studies were done to compare base prices to community or off-base tobacco prices. And so very broadly, these studies typically have been national studies of all military service branches. They've typically done phone-based data collection where they're calling on-base stores at exchanges and off-base stores. And they've typically only been done on cigarette products, both premium and discount brands. And then they've looked at differences in prices on military bases compared to those off-base community stores. But most of these off-base community stores that the comparisons have been made to have been with mass merchandisers such as Walmart. So I'm just going to go over some of the findings that these past studies have found that have been looking at these price differences. So between 2011 and 2013, researchers found that Marlboro Red, which we would consider a premium product, prices were significantly cheaper on military bases than in the nearby community stores. A study on Newport menthol cigarettes found that the cost was an average of 23% less on military bases than in local community Walmarts. And remember, we're comparing this to the policy that says 5% is the cutoff. And then a study also looked at prices from 2013 to early 2014, and they found that 18% of military retailers were selling Marlboro Red at prices below that 5%. And then again, they found that military retail cigarette prices versus internal community prices, that 6.2% had lower than average community prices. So this last bullet point is an interesting study because instead of calling local Walmarts, what they did is they used the internal documents that the military exchanges use to see what is the community price and what is the competitive price. So these are the internal documents that the exchanges actually use to set those prices of cigarette products. And again, they still were lower than that 5%. So I did want to point out one of the tables from one of the studies. And so this study was recently published in 2017. And I'll bring your attention to this, see where my cursor is, this top highlighted row here. So if you look at this row says mean. And so this is telling us the percent savings on cigarettes from military exchanges. And we can see that it differs by the branches. So we see that it ranges from 3 in the US Marine Corps to 7.6 in the US Air Force. So the savings are differing between these branches and are quite large on Air Force bases. And then if you look at the bottom highlighted row, so this is telling the percent of exchanges that were not compliant with that DoD policy of having the price within 5% of the lowest competitive price. And we can see that this is ranging as well from about 7.7 in the Marine Corps, all the way up to 18.5% in the US Army. So it's clear from these past studies that despite that policy being implemented, there still is quite a disparity in the price of cigarettes and military exchanges compared to those in the community stores. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to discussing our study and what we did. And so our study specifically only focused on Air Force bases, as our colleagues, or a few of them, are actually working at universities or stationed on Air Force bases. So today I will just be going over those results and talking about airmen and the Air Force bases and what we found. So a little bit of background. So more than a quarter of airmen who are called airmen regardless of gender or rank report regular tobacco use prior to military service. So airmen are required to complete 8.5 weeks of basic military training and 4 weeks of technical training. And so there is a requirement that during this training period that airmen must all be tobacco free. And so Dr. Little, who again, I mentioned will be doing an upcoming podcast to answer some more of your questions you may all have, did a study with airmen and found that 63% of airmen actually state that they're completely confident that they will remain tobacco free for a year following this period of forced abstinence during their technical training. However, her study and other studies have also shown that people still initiate after enlistment. And one of the statistics that has been found is that 15% of airmen still report initiating tobacco use after enlistment. So we conducted a study, again, just focused on airmen. And the current study, or what I'm going to talk about today, was the first to assess disparities in the pricing, availability, and marketing of multiple tobacco products, both on base and off base, through in-person tobacco retailer assessments at multiple tobacco retailer store types. And so the things that are kind of underlined and italicized here are just what's kind of unique about our study. We're the first to look at multiple tobacco products beyond just cigarettes. And then we also did in-person assessments and did not limit our sample to just mass merchandisers. Okay, so sample. So our sample consisted of all Air Force bases and installations where about 99% of airmen conduct the technical training that I mentioned before. So here you can see our locations. We were in California and we're at 2 bases, so Presidio, Monterey, and Vandenberg Air Force Base. We were also in Texas, and then we also visited 1 base in Mississippi. So as many of you know, we do not have a national tobacco retailer licensing list. So to identify on-base tobacco retailer outlets, we consulted with base maps and Air Force Base civilian staff to identify all of these stores. And then we use state business and tobacco retailer licensing websites to identify nearby off-base community tobacco retailers. And then these retailers that were off base and on base, but mostly off base is kind of the harder list to make, they were verified by our data collector using ground truthing. So she went and visited all these bases, went to the stores on base, and then drove around all the bases to identify the 10 closest off-base community retailers near each of these gates. And then for all of these stores, because we are interested in tobacco retailers, she confirmed that each of these stores sold tobacco in order to be eligible for our study.
The question that came in
Yeah.
For your pass 2 slides ago, it said, is the 15% of the airmen who initiate after enlistment a subsection of the 63% of airmen who state that they are confident that they can remain tobacco free?
Yeah, so the 15% was actually from a different study in here. So I do not think it was a subsection of it. Later at the end of the slides, I have references, and that's something I'll have Jackie make note of, and we can get back to you on sending those references if you'd like more information on that. Good question. Okay. So for completed STAR audit, so we visited 80 off-base retailers, and then we visited, there were a total of 28 on-base retailers, and we were only able to visit 26 of those because 2 were closed due to a forest fire. So in total, we visited 108 tobacco retailers. And so to assess the retailer environment, we used a modified version of STARS, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And we assessed the things I'll focus on today that we assessed are the availability of cigarette packs and cartons, cigarillos, cigars, smokeless tobacco, electronic cigarettes. We also looked at interior price promotions, and then we assessed the price of cigarettes, Copenhagen smokeless, and Vuse disposable e-cigarettes. Okay, so for the results, so first I'll go over what we found just descriptively about the availability of cigarettes. So just to orient you to this figure, so again, the dark blue is representing on-base or Air Force Base tobacco retailers, while the lighter blue is representing our off-base or community retailers. And so at the bottom here, again, this is just for cigarettes, so you can see we assessed prices and availability of packs and cartons of all these types of cigarettes. And so we assessed this for the cheapest pack or carton of cigarettes, Marlboro Red, and Newport Menthol. And so first on the left for the cheapest, we see that packs of the cheapest cigarette were available in all on-base retailers. And then we also see that while all on-base retailers were less likely to sell packs of Marlboro Red and Newport Menthol than off-base retailers, all of these on-base retailers had cartons of all three of these types of cigarettes. So next I'll look at availability of other tobacco products. So again, we have the on-base in dark blue, the off-base in light blue, and then here are the different products we looked at. And we looked at if there were any of these products, singles or flavored of these products, and then some specific brands. And so just a few key findings I'll highlight. So we found that cigarillos and e-cigarettes were pretty common in all stores, and there was pretty little variation in the availability of these products, either on-base or off-base. And so we found that cigars and smokeless tobacco were more prevalent on-base than off-base. And in fact, cigars were sold in 66%, about 67% of on-base retailers, compared with just 20% of off-base retailers, while smokeless tobacco was available in about 15% more stores on-base compared with off-base.
I have a question that came in.
Yep.
So I asked, what does it mean to be off base? Is this still DoD property or is this city property?
Yeah, so off base means it is not on an Air Force base, so it is not DoD property. That's a great clarification. So on base means these are retailers or exchanges or commissaries is what you may hear them as referred to. And so these are retailers that the airmen can visit and that they're actually on the Air Force base and they're gated in. And so those are the retailers, the on-base retailers that don't charge sales tax and things like that. Versus off-base retailers are like civilian retailers. So anyone can visit those and they're not actually on the Air Force base. Thanks for asking for that clarification. So we also looked at interior price promotions. So we found that price promotions were more common in on-base or those Air Force-based retailers for cigarettes and smokeless tobacco compared with off-base stores. Promotions for cigarillos were actually much less common at only 25% on Air Force-based stores compared with off-base community stores. For all types of stores, so both the Air Force-based stores and the community or civilian stores, most tobacco products were promoted through special prices on one or more products. And then consistent with a DoD instruction or policy, none of the Air Force-based retailers had any exterior tobacco marketing, but all of the off-base retailers or community stores did have exterior tobacco marketing for at least one type of tobacco product. So next I'm going to go over the different things we found about prices. So again, on-base prices over here to the left, and those are the retailers you would find at the Air Force base. And then here are the off-base prices or what you would find in a community store that civilians may visit. And so these are just the average prices. So first, if you look over here, we see that the average price of the cheapest pack of cigarettes was $4.40. in Air Force Base retailers. But if you go to those off-base stores, the average price was higher at $4.93. And so we also looked at cartons. So again, you can see the cheapest carton, or the cheapest cigarette carton, was $45.46 on average at Air Force Base tobacco retailers. And this was higher at $47.82 in off-base retailers. You see the same trend for Marlboro Red and Newport Menthol, where generally the prices are lower on the on-base retailers for both packs of cigarettes and cartons, and then the prices are higher for off-base retailers. Copenhagen, we see a pretty big difference here too. So we can see that on average, the price of a single tin of Copenhagen smokeless was $3.89 at Air Force Base tobacco retailers, but this was much higher at off-base stores at an average of $4.42. And then all on-base Air Force Base retailers had Vuse disposable e-cigarettes for a flat $11. And then this averaged out about $11.47 in off-base stores. So the next thing we did is we ran models to test whether these differences in prices were statistically significant, while also accounting for the type of nesting or clustering of tobacco retailers within each geographic area. So since we had multiple retailers that we visited in the same type of geographic area, we wanted to account for potential similarities just because they were near each other. And so here we see that the pack of the cheapest pack of cigarettes on-base retailers was significantly lower. So it was 54 cents cheaper in on-base stores compared to off-base stores. And then cartons of the cheapest cigarette were $2.60 cheaper in on-base stores compared to those off-base stores, but this was not statistically significant. Again, we see similar trends. So Marlboro Red, we can focus on that, and we see that packs of cigarettes on-base stores were 80 cents cheaper, and that was significant. And cartons were $6.89 cheaper in Air Force Base retailers compared to those community stores. Newport Menthol, we see a similar trend. So packs were significantly lower at 87 cents, and cartons were $6.58. We found that Copenhagen smokeless, so again, this was for a single tin, was 65 cents cheaper in on-base stores than our off-base ones. And then Vuse was about 50 cents cheaper, but this was not significant. So just to wrap up kind of the key findings that we thought were interesting in this study. So we found that the price of packs of cigarettes were about 11 to 12% cheaper at Air Force Base retailers compared with community ones. And again, that policy, it should be 5%, right? On-base savings for Marlboro Red and Newport Menthol packs were between 80 cents and 87 cents, which this translates to about a $292 to $318 savings for a pack per day smoker. The cheapest packs sold in military installments were more than 50 cents cheaper than those sold off base. And this amounts to an annual savings of about $183 for a pack a day smoker. And then we also found that Copenhagen smokeless was 65 cents cheaper in those on-base retailers. Cigarette cartons were available for purchase in all on-base stores, as I mentioned earlier, compared with just 61% of off-base community retailers. And then interior price promotions were particularly prevalent for both cigarettes and smokeless tobacco. And these are the products for which the on-base versus off-base availability and price differentials were the highest in our sample. So policy implications. So in March 2017, a new memorandum or policy was put into effect by the Department of Defense. So this memorandum or policy went into effect after our study. And so what this memorandum did is it kind of amended what the previous policy was that I mentioned earlier. So instead, it now reads that the lowest local competitive price to which on-base or Air Force Base or military base prices are compared to must include all taxes that would be applicable off-base. So it seems that there was this recognition that if taxes are not included that civilians would be paying, like sales tax, these prices are going to be lower no matter what. So this policy is now in effect, but other researchers have noted that there may still be some limitations in these definitions. So the definition of local, which is tied to the competitive price or the local competitive price, is subjective, and there's no definition in the policy outlined for that. And then the comparison sources to find what the local competitive price is can differ a lot between military exchanges and bases. And so that may produce some differences despite this policy now including taxes in the pricing. Some other policies to consider are a minimum floor price, which is basically you set a single price for tobacco products. So for example, you say the cheapest a pack of cigarettes can be in a store is $6 or $7. And so that's a policy option to try and close this pricing disparity. Another one is to restrict and ban coupons or price promotions. So as I noted, we did find some differences in availability of interior price promotions. And as they imply, and as many of you know, these can substantially lower the actual price that people are paying for tobacco products. So implementing a policy regulating this could also close that disparity. But overall, we concluded, and something to keep in mind is that there needs to be continued monitoring of both the pricing and availability of not just cigarettes, but of multiple tobacco product types, especially smokeless, which is one of the second most high seized tobacco products in the military, and continued monitoring of the advertising across all military branches, especially after the implementation of this policy, to see whether it's closing that pricing disparity and how that may be affecting different service branches. And so that's all I have for you all today for the review. Here's just a quick summary box. My contact information is on here. And then as I have mentioned a few times, while I only talked about our study today, Counter Tools will be having that upcoming podcast with Dr. Little, who's at UVA. And so if you have questions that you would be interested in her discussing or answering, feel free to send those in to help@countertools.org. And then if you can just make the subject line military tobacco use so that we're able to easily find those and forward them on, that would be great. And as I mentioned earlier, I have several slides at the end with references for you all, but otherwise I am open for any questions or discussion people may have.
We have a couple more minutes, so please send in your questions for Amanda. Just type them into the Q&A box and we'll try to answer them today. And like she mentioned, if you have any kind of more specific questions, please send those to help@countertools.org and we'll definitely get those answered during the podcast we have with Dr. Little. But yeah, we'll take another 10, 15 more minutes. If you have any questions, just drop them in the Q&A box. Looks like we had some questions come in. So in that graph that you had earlier between the different branches, someone asked, were the differences in smoking behavior among branches statistically significant?
Yeah, so I am not sure if this was done. So you'll see at the bottom here that this graphic was done by the DoD back in 2011. And so this document I was showing Jackie yesterday is like around 400 pages, and I can't remember if they checked for statistical significance or not, but this is one of the references at the end that is open access, and I highly recommend looking at if you're interested in military populations in general. So they conducted the survey back in 2011, and it's over an array of health-related behaviors, substance use, mental health, physical activity, sexual health, things like that. And then it was published in 2013. And so that's open access. Unfortunately, they don't have a more updated one, and I'm not sure if they're in the works of trying to update that in the future. But it's a really great resource for looking at not only tobacco use among the population, but also just general health and health behaviors.
Okay, we have another question that came in. It said, do you have any summary or key findings of flavored versus non-flavored tobacco products through your study?
Yeah, so all we have on that is we were looking at availability as kind of an exploratory analysis. So we did not actually have the power to test if there was statistical significance between on-base and off-base for flavored products. So what we have is just in this graph, and then again in the paper, which I can send on to Jackie, that has all the numbers in it, that will tell you for cigarillos, here's the difference in percentages, which you can see is they're pretty similar, honestly, with cigarillos with flavored. For cigars, flavored cigars were only common in, or were only available in off-base retailers and not on-base. One thing I thought was interesting, and I asked Melissa about, or Dr. Little about, was the cigar rate of availability is much higher in on-base retailers, and I guess cigars are used a lot as a celebratory type of thing, and so she could say that is one reason of why they were more prevalent, but flavors were not available in any of the on-base stores we saw. You do see a difference in smokeless here, right? So it's about 70% flavored in off-base stores, but about 90% in on-base stores. And then a kind of a smaller difference for flavored e-cigarettes. So we have descriptive results of those that are in the paper, but we did not test for statistical significance between the retailer type.
And then a follow-up question to that, does this flavor term on this slide include menthol?
Yes, so we included menthol, great question, as being a flavor.
We have another question that came in. With all we know about the dangers of tobacco, why does the DoD allow our military members to be targeted with cheaper prices by the tobacco industry? In the end, the DoD is paying higher health costs.
That's a great question, and I do not think I have the answer to that. There are lots of policy memorandums and instructions, like I mentioned a few, where they have tried to limit marketing. So for example, I mentioned how exterior marketing is not allowed on any on-base retailers, and especially marketing that's directed specifically at the military or veterans. But I don't know the answer to that question. I think our place as researchers is to keep kind of documenting these differences, since we know tobacco kills and we know it's a huge problem with this population, and to keep trying to document it and get that information to them.
Okay. We have another question that came in. What is the likelihood that the DoD will fully commit to the health of their members with regard to tobacco and disallow tobacco product sales on properties? So eliminating smoke breaks, smoke-free buildings, housing, and vehicles. So yeah, what is the likelihood that the DoD will fully commit? Yeah.
So that's another hard question that I don't think I can answer. It's a lot broader with our government and the DoD itself. Melissa, Dr. Little, I would maybe bring some of these questions about these other policies. So Dr. Little has a lot more expertise, and her focus and her group at UVA is focused on military populations and looking at some of these differences. And so some of these policies that you just mentioned, like smoke breaks, and smoke-free buildings, things like that. I would actually specifically, and we can write this down, write these policies down, and whether there's any work that's being done on that to improve any of these types of policies to target military populations and help protect them.
Feel free to send any more questions in as you have them.
You guys have great hard questions.
Okay.
We had another question that came in. Do you have 1 to 2 talking points when a city council member says, why should we pass T21 when you can go to war at 18 years old?
Yeah, so again, I don't have a lot of expertise in this, but something that I've heard, and I know that some people have tried to push, is that there's, I'm sure all of you have heard this, that there's, if you can go to war, why can't you have the freedom to smoke? And so I know that there has been some framing, especially with smoking and cigarette smoking, that not framing it really as a freedom to smoke, but the same people who are in the service and serving should be able to be free from an addiction that kills them and harms them. So trying to reframe it as not the freedom to smoke, but the freedom to be free from an addiction, and especially from an industry that is targeting these products at this population.
Okay, so it looks like there's no more questions at this time, but we will stay on the line for another 10 or so more minutes to answer any questions you all have. And to reiterate, we'll be having a follow-up podcast with Dr. Little coming up, date to be determined, but just look out for any announcements about that podcast, and we will actually take some of your questions that you all have submitted and give those to Melissa to answer during that podcast. So like I said, if you all have any questions, if you're just thinking of things when you go home, just please send us an email at help@countertools.org, and we'll be sure to have her answer those when she can. And then this webinar will be recorded, or has been recorded, and the slides will be available to you all. So after this webinar, I will get the recording and the slides put together, and I will email it to everyone on this webinar. So you will have the recording and the slides. I just wanted to answer one more question before we end it. So another question came in: do T21 laws in California, Oregon, et cetera, extend to DoD properties within those states, or just off base? Do T21 laws in some of these states extend to DoD properties within those states, or just off base?
Yeah, I am not sure of the answer to that. Right off the bat, I would think that because T21 is being done at the state level, so these are state policies versus federal, that the states may have say in that and how they are writing these policies and whether or not it exempts military populations or not. But I'm not completely certain on that. That's something we can follow up with Melissa on. But I would think because T21 is being done at the state level at this point, that is probably something states need to take into consideration.
We have some comments about that. So one said California has an exception for military. Thought military members were excluded from T21 in California, and then some T21 have military exemptions.
Yep, so it sounds like because it is a state policy, that's something that is being written into legislation at the state level.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all so much for being on this webinar. Like I said, we'll be on the line for a couple more minutes. Send in your questions now or send them in to help@countertools.org. Thank you so much. Hope you all learned a little something about the intersection between tobacco and the military. And you all have a great rest of your day. We did get a question in, another question in. Did you need to have approval from the DoD or each Air Force base to conduct this study? If so, how did you develop that partnership and how long did it take?
Yeah, so to be able to go on to on-base returns, we did have to get that approved through their like research branch. I forget the technical term for it, but it did have to get approved so that we could go on the basis, because those are gated and we are sending a data collector and a civilian in to get this information. And so I was not actually part of the team of the co-authors who initially started making those relationships to be able to go on base and do that. That's a question we'll put down for Melissa. So Dr. Little, and then you'll see, I'll go back to the very beginning. Dr. Klesges, and there's one other co-author, Dr. and Colonel Talcott. They are all doing research on this topic, and so they were stationed on Air Force bases and at schools that have a lot of airmen. So you'll see here are disclosures of where each of us are from, and you'll see that some of the bases are on here. So luckily with our co-authors, we already had some existing relationships to be able to build that. But that would be a great question that we'll write down and forward on to Melissa about kind of cultivating those relationships and getting approval to be able to, one, go and collect the research, and then we also have to get approval to be able to publish it as well.
I have a follow-up question to that. Why did you choose the Air Force branch versus other branches for the study? Do you think it is a comparable study to other branches?
Yeah, so one of our main conclusions is that we do think that other studies should be done with other branches. And so right now, for some of those past studies that we looked at and talked about, they looked at pricing disparities by different branches, and you do see some differences by service branch, but those are limited to cigarette products. So for future research, we do think that more studies should be done that are looking across branches at multiple tobacco product types. And again, because we already had colleagues and co-authors who were working specifically with Air Force bases and with this population, this was kind of our first study at wanting to look at these other products, and we already had those connections with the community. So that's why we focused specifically on this branch. But yeah, we do think it needs to be done in other branches to see if there are other disparities, since as you saw, prices can differ and also the use rates differ by service branch.
We got another question in for those still on the line. Do you think the amount of tobacco availability on the bases may have been influenced by the number of people on base, or do the bases have about the same population, same size population and demographics? So do you think the amount of tobacco availability on the bases may have been influenced by the number of people on base, or did the bases have the same population and demographics?
Yeah, so that was not something that we specifically looked at as it wasn't one of our main research questions for this study. So that I didn't present this table, but we do have in the paper where you can see the number of airmen that are trained at each base, and it does differ between bases, and the size of the bases differs as well, so the land area. And the number of retailers differed at each of those bases. So I am not sure if that influenced the availability, as that wasn't one of our main questions, so we didn't look at that specifically in the study.
Okay, so it looks like there's no more questions. For those of you still on the line, thank you so much again for being on the webinar, and please send in any questions to help@countertools.org for our podcast with Dr. Little. Have a great day.